Hello and welcome to the recorded lesson over reforming American society. This lesson will cover a few different reform movements that take place in the 1800s, alongside larger movements like the fight for women's rights and the abolitionist movement, which we've already covered in this unit. The next movement that we focus on is a religious movement. And this religious movement, we give the name the Second Great Awakening. We have talked about the Great Awakening in the 1700s, when we look at the Great Awakening and the Enlightenment in the 16 and 1700s. A second Great Awakening, takes place in the United States. A renewal of religious faith in the 1790s and early 1800s is called the Second Great Awakening. This does actually lead to more people thinking about the lives of other people, the betterment of other people, and the fact that all people, no matter their condition or their past experience or their status in life, could be saved in a religious sense. Unlike the Puritans, who came over in the early portion of the United States history, the Puritans believed that only some people could be saved. Revivalist preachers during the Great Awakening insisted that anyone could be saved. So this opens salvation and a sense of worth and belonging to millions more people, a larger percentage of those people in the United States. This idea really appeals to the American sense of equality, that everybody has a chance to succeed, really plays into that American dream. Many groups, such as Baptist and Methodist, gained a lot of converts during this time. Converts mean that people join that religion or that group. So a lot of people joined the Baptist and the Methodist because of this preaching of, you can have success or you can be saved and get forgiveness from God no matter who you are. You could be very poor, you could be white, you could be black, it doesn't matter. Settlers in the West eagerly awaited revivalist preachers like Peter Cartwright, and this movement awakened a spirit of reform in the United States. Many people began to believe that they could help right the wrongs of the world. So this style of preaching, this style of bringing religion to anyone, really kickstarts reform movements like abolitionists, like the women's rights movement, like some of the other ones that we're going to look at here. One of these movements that does get kicked up in this time period is the temperance movement. The temperance movement is a campaign to stop the drinking of alcohol. So essentially, one major issue for a wide variety of people in the United States was that some men were spending a lot of their wages on going to the bar, spending out on alcohol, and a lot of women join in this movement because they are seeing their home lives, their families, their husbands kind of being torn down by this addiction to alcohol or this overindulgence in it. Temperance supporters got 1 million people to sign a pledge to stop drinking. And by 1855, 13 states had banned the sale of liquor everywhere. So, like in the whole entire state, you could not buy any sort of alcohol. The movement remained strong into the 20th century, so all the way until the 1900s. And in the 1900s, we're actually going to see a constitutional amendment that bans the sale of alcohol in in the United States completely, and prohibition. So that outlaws everything. And this is the start of that movement. Obviously, that constitutional amendment does get canceled out later because there's alcohol sales current in modern day. Workers' rights. In the early 1800s, factory workers labored for 12 to 14 hours or more a day for 6 days a week, only usually getting maybe Sunday off as an observant of like religion. They would work most of the day in dark, hot, crowded rooms with air that was so unfiltered and dirty that it made it difficult to breathe. Because if you think about it, none of the machines that are being run are really probably being run in at a very like non-pollutant or um, efficient manner. In the 1830s, many workers began to call for a 10-hour workday, so to cut the work hours down a little bit. And hoping to increase profits, work owners sometimes cut pay and forced workers to increase their pace. So instead of slowing things down and hoping that they would get um, have safer environment, because the faster you work, the more likely it is that you are going to make a mistake or have an accident. A lot of times what they would ask the workers to do is just, well, work for less money and produce more. And the reason that they're able to do this is because there's no laws that say, hey, you have to treat your workers one way or the other, you have to pay them this amount of money. um, and they can basically do whatever they want, and then they're just going to fire you if you don't listen. And there's always going to be somebody that is willing to take up your job. Some workers form labor unions. A labor union is a group of workers who band together to seek better working conditions. So, the idea here is that instead of maybe just individually, a worker individually on their own doesn't have much power, much say against the powerful, company owner with all of his money and all of his power. But if you have 100 workers and they all work together for one common thing, they might have a little bit more strength and a little bit more power. In 1835 and 1836, labor unions really do um, show their strength. 140 strikes take place in the eastern United States. But the Panic of 1837, which is kind of like a depression, an economic depression, so a lot of people lose their jobs, a lot of people lose their money. This makes it really hard to get a job. So you can't really strike when there aren't any jobs to be had. You want to keep your job no matter what, even if it's dangerous or even if you're getting paid less. So the workers didn't want to cause more trouble and they didn't want to get fired. So the movement kind of does fall apart in the mid 1800s, but they do make gains and it does set up progress to be made later on. Social reform. The Second Great Awakening sparks a rise in social reform, or the caring of others around you and making society better. Social reformers campaign to improve education, establish mental hospitals, and improve prisons. One of the main leaders of the education movement is Horace Mann. He argued for improving public education opportunities, so expanding public schooling to all people in the United States and not just maybe wealthy people or people in cities. Boston opened the first public high school in 1821, and a few other northern cities soon did the same. So, this idea that if we can improve the education, we improve society overall. Churches and other groups founded hundreds of private colleges, Oberlin, Notre Dame, and Northwestern, to name a few. During the 1800s, women and African Americans gained opportunities in colleges, but still many were barred from public education. So they are opening education up to many, but it is not all. And it is still going to be a fight to expand those rights to all people. Some reformers sought to improve care for society's most vulnerable members. In 1841, Dorothea Dix, a reformer from Boston, was teaching at a women's jail when she discovered that some of the women were locked up simply because they were mentally ill. So a lot of times, instead of dealing with the problems of the people in the society, instead of like helping them, they would just throw them in jail to keep them separated from everybody else, and then that's they don't have to deal with them. Those mentally ill people often didn't receive any treatment. They didn't get any better. They didn't get anything to help them, and instead were just beaten or chained, instead of actually services that would do them any good. So she lectured all across the country to promote better care, and her efforts did lead to publicly funded mental health hospitals in a number of states. Thomas H. Gallagher started the first free school for deaf children. Samuel G. Howell directed the New England Asylum for the Blind, which is now known as the Perkins School for the Blind. So these are all examples of before these reform movements, people that were at disadvantages or that had disabilities or were society's most vulnerable did not have a lot of supports. They did not have a lot of opportunities, and they didn't have a lot of ways to succeed, and instead were kind of cast aside. And because of these reform movements, people begin to focus on what can we do to improve not just the lives of myself but the lives of those around me, because if the lives of those around me are improved, then my life can also be improved. If everybody has opportunity, then we all have more opportunity. Reformers also tried to improve prisons. In the early 1800s, debtors, lifelong criminals, and children were all put in the same cell. So murderers and children who maybe stole something, they would all be in the same place. People who owed money to other people, they would all be in the same cell, the same prison, the same conditions, everything. They also they called for adult prisoners to be rehabilitated or kind of prepared to live useful lives after their release. So instead of just saying you've made a mistake, you're going to go into prison and that's where you're going to stay because you're always going to be a criminal and you can never get better. People in the 1800s really tried to focus on prison as a place to kind of rehabilitate and get better to maybe re-enter society and not just waste away in prison just because of a mistake or anything like that. So these reform movements again really improve the lives of those people who are at most the most vulnerable of society, and these all of these reform movements all build upon one another to build towards larger reform movements like I've talked about with abolitionists, women's rights, education, um, and all of those types of things. So that is it for this lesson.